Curious Lloyd.
The Wild West, also known as the Old West, was an astoundingly pretty awesome period in American history, but clearly pop culture has turned much of the true West into stupid untrue legend. They were never quick draw artists who could shoot a 6-gun out of your hand with another 6-gun, but the basics were true. The lawlessness, the guns, the constant Indian attacks. Well, not exactly, as I shall now explain why. Settlers were constantly clashing with Indians. So the myth was, old Westerners treated Native Americans kind of like the Walking Dead treats zombies. Sudden murderous ambushes could come from anywhere, at any time. Any expedition into the Indian territory came with the warning that you'd better go well armed. When the wagon trains saw the raid of the Cherokee or the Sioux coming, they would circle the wagons to form a defense perimeter. And to this day, circle the wagons is shorthand for hunker down and fight back. And all of this has to be true. We know that the horrific numbers of people died when settlers expanded to the west. Those frontiersmen must have been firing bullets and dodging arrows on a daily basis though, surely. Well, the reality is, not really. Granted, between the United States Cavalry and pretty much every tribe you can name, things certainly got good and massacre-y, but skirmishes between Native Americans and the typical American settlers trundling along in his covered wagon hardly ever happened. Of all the hundreds and thousands of pioneers who willingly trudged all the way through Nebraska, only a few hundred died in clashes with Native Americans. Not tens of thousands, not even thousands, about 300 to 400. To put that number in perspective, the total number of pioneer deaths on the Oregon Trail from all causes, including disease, numbered 10,000 to 30,000, which means only 1 to 4% of all trial fatalities can be attributed to Native Americans. I would have definitely thought more settlers were accidentally trampled by their own cattle. During this same period, settlers killed over 400 Native Americans. Again, that's not many, but it does mean that the vast majority of settlers never got into murderous conflicts with hostile tribes. It was far more likely that the average settler would trade with the Native Americans or hire members of various tribes as guides, rather than fight them. It wasn't necessarily because they were open-minded and peace-loving that they abstained from violence, but rather that it's never good business to kill your customers, or vice versa, especially when you're talking about someone providing a potential life-saving service or a guide that kept you from getting lost, although when getting lost meant getting dead. Native American deaths caused by the US government and the military likely number in the millions. No one's disputing that one. But deaths due to wagon train clashes were few and far between. As for the circling the wagons thing, the ring formation was done each night not to keep hostile Indians out, but to keep their absurdly expensive cattle from wandering off. It wouldn't even be possible to circle the wagons in an emergency. These wagon trains typically travelled spread out in a line several miles wide, rather than in a column that the term train suggests. In an effort to avoid each other's dust, wheel ruts and debris, it would have taken hours to get everybody together and hook up in a circle formation. Bankrobbing Outlaws ruled the West. So the myth was, Black Bart, the Dalton Gang, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid all were famous for their daring robberies. They could take entire fortunes from banks that had slightly less security than a modern-day hot dog stand. And why not? Lawlessness ruled, vaults didn't exist, and criminals didn't give a crap. The banks might as well have left their big white bags of gold sitting on the porch. But the reality is, research can find evidence of only about 8 true bank heists, and that's across 15 states in 40 years. As a point of comparison, bank robberies in 2010 amounted to 5,600, so even if we'd never seen a Western in our lives, that would seem like a low number. But there are several things to consider. First of all, towns back in those days were much smaller, with the sheriff's office, saloon, general store and banks usually clustered together for convenience. This one-stop social needs block usually made up the dead centre of the town. Being that the sheriff's office was usually no more than a few doors down, you were probably pulling your big heist within the earshot of the law. Secondly, the banks actually weren't that easy to get in and out of. Old West buildings were usually built pretty close together, meaning the bank would be flanked by other buildings, while a reinforced back wall would keep anyone from intruding from behind. So when you walk out the front door with the loot, there's a sheriff waiting for you. But the most famous robberies, the jobs pulled by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, were actually true. But that's not the point. They got famous for a reason. They were doing what nobody else was crazy enough to do. But for everyday criminals, common targets were often trains and stagecoaches because they were more isolated, easier to get into, and easier to escape. So why bother with a bank, which would be a suicide mission in comparison? Cowboys are an American creation. So the myth was, one reason Americans have always been so in love with the Old West is that it's so distinctly American. If you find a political rally of people proclaiming themselves to be patriots, you can bet you'll find cowboy hats in the crowd. The more of a cowboy you are, the more American you are. Even Theodore Roosevelt got in on the act by calling himself the cowboy candidate. He said giddy up, and every horse on the continent responded. But the reality is, cowboys weren't an American invention at all. In fact, they precede Plymouth Rock by some 20 years, meaning they are older than America itself. The original cowboys were Mexican cattlemen, known as vaqueros, and they are literally everything you imagine a cowboy to be. They came up with all the cowboy lingo, including bronco, lariat, and even stampede. Vaqueros rode the long-haul cattle drives, and their sombreros were probably the precursor to the cowboy hats. They also wore chaps, held rodeos, and lived the life of a cowboy in relative anonymous for some 200 years. When Americans moved westward, it was these vaqueros who knew the land and the wildlife enough to help teach the future American cowboys everything they knew. The settlers in turn did the right thing and outright stole the entire culture, including the title of the vaqueros, which was turned into buckaroos. But it's not like the vaqueros went in the way of the cowboy at the time, either. Despite what Hollywood would have you believe, not every cowboy, or human being for that matter, was a white male. 1 in 3 cowboys were Mexican vaqueros. 1 in 4 are believed to be black men, who were released from slavery, but didn't have the ability to flee far from their captors. Even the Native Americans would help move the cattle with their white, Mexican, and black brethren. It was a rainbow cowboy coalition, except if you were Chinese, then you were building railway roads in hellish conditions. Cowboys wore cowboy hats. The myth was, the ultimate item of a cowboy outfit was of course the Stetson hat, which most of us just call a cowboy hat. There's always the boots too, but they do kinda go together as a pair. The hats were practical, lightweight, and made with utility in mind. They had curved edges that they could defend you from both sun and rain, and they made you look incredibly stylish while doing what amounted to staring at cows for weeks at a time. The curved brim, the dips in the crown, the band, the Stetson is about as iconic as clothing gets. So if you get in your time machine and set it for 1870, you better be packing one of these. But the reality was, lots of people wore hats back then. That part is true, but they seem to wear everything but what we think of as cowboy hats. Here's Billy the Kid wearing some kind of messed up top hat, and here's Wild Bill Hickok wearing a woman's flat pancake hat. But what you would have seen mostly back then were bowler hats. They were more popular because they were a little more versatile in various social situations, especially in a time where all men wore hats at the time. In fact, famed Western historian Lucius went so far as to call it the hat that won the West. Looking back on most of the portraits from the time, you can find that almost every single major name in the West owned a bowler hat. Even the cowboy hats the Stetson was making in the late 1800s didn't look like the Stetson hats we call cowboy hats today. Originally known as the Boss of the Plains, it looked more like a modern day Amish hat and may have just been a modified sombrero. All of the curling and ornamentation came later, but this hat is the granddaddy of every cowboy hat in the world today, and that's not exactly what jumps into your mind when you're thinking of cowboy hats, is it? Guns were rampant in the Old West, so the myth was, well, even if cowboys didn't have cowboy hats, we know that they had 6-shooters on their hips. Back then, every man, woman and child came pre-equipped with an old-time revolver, which was used from everything from personal defense and hunting to celebrating. But really, the reality was, regardless of the public's perception, gun control laws may have actually been stricter back then in the 19th and early 20th century than they are now, especially in the West. In the beginning, there was definitely gun violence, as there was neither a standardized law nor a good way to enforce it. But the Wild West didn't stay wild forever. As towns formed and communities grew, the need for tolerance of handguns started to fall. Starting in 1878, some 25 years into the westward expansion, action was finally taken. Even places as wild as Dodge City started posting signs like this one. The gunfight at the OK Corral was caused by one gang being unwilling to abide by the anti-firearm rule of Tombstone. But it's not like the 6-shooters of the time was very dangerous anyway. They didn't even use regular bullets like they currently do, instead of opting for the so-called cap and ball system. That was little more than a marble launched by black powder. It had an effective range of 50 feet or less. The Adams, one of the first revolvers introduced at the time and a hallmark weapon of the era, would burn the living hell out of your hand whilst launching the bullet, so you had to be really sure that you wanted to shoot that person. That's why, even among those who used guns, 6-shooters weren't the favourite. They were little more than a weapon of last resort. Shotguns and rifles were the preferred weapons, having both the powder and the range to put down a mountain lion or a card-cheating drunk. But, to be fair, who would want to watch a western where cowboys were meeting at high at noon to shoot each other in the face with huge shotguns? If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and I will catch you again next week.
Hast du gesehen in deiner Leben? They darker than us. Woof!
1, 2, 3.